Martha Bellamy was sipping her morning coffee on the porch of Bellamy Farm, listening to the AM weather report when the grinding clank of a tow truck pierced the stillness. She set her mug down, squinting toward the front gate. Beyond the dogwood trees that lined the gravel driveway, a red and white tow truck lurched into view, its boom arm rattling like an old skeleton. For a moment, she thought it had taken a wrong turn. But the truck slowed, then stopped, right at the fence line. Her stomach dropped. A week earlier, she'd gotten one of those letters again, printed on thick cream paper with the Clearbrook Hills HOA seal. It was laced with flowery language, but the message was the same. Stay in your lane. Or better yet, give it up. The last sentence had stuck with her. Land boundaries should be respected for the good of the neighborhood. She rose from the rocking chair, smoothed the front of her flannel shirt, and stepped down the porch stairs, her boots crunching over the dewy grass. The sun was still low, slanting through the oak trees in long golden streaks. Honeysuckle clung to the fence posts. Chickens pecked lazily near the barn. Will's SUV, an old dark blue Suburban with faded plates and a dent in the bumper, was parked near the entrance, just off the dirt path. He'd rolled in the night before after an 11-hour drive from North Carolina. Now it was squarely in the tow truck's crosshairs. The driver, a man in his 30s wearing a reflective vest and tired eyes, stepped out and unfolded a clipboard. Martha got there first. "Excuse me," she called, calm but firm. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" He adjusted his cap, shifting awkwardly. "Ma'am, I got a removal order from the Clearbrook Hills HOA. Says this vehicle is in violation of the parking ordinance, unregistered, improperly parked, and obstructing shared visibility frontage." Martha blinked. "Visibility frontage? This is our driveway. That's our fence." She pointed to the faded wood post just a few feet back. "That car is on Bellamy land." The man looked at the clipboard again, then up at her. "I don't want trouble. I'm just following orders." "Trouble's what you'll have if you lay a finger on that car," she said, voice tightening. A voice behind her cut the air like citrus. "Martha," said Cynthia Wexler, stepping delicately around a cluster of blue irises near the gate. She wore white slacks and a pale pink blouse, not a speck of dust on her ballet flats. Her smile was fixed, teeth white against her bronzed skin. "Let's not make a scene." Martha turned slowly. "What is this, Cynthia?" "Just enforcement," Cynthia said brightly, waving a printed packet like a trophy. "Your brother's vehicle violates HOA guidelines. It's not just where it's parked. It's the fact that it hasn't been registered with the HOA board, has out-of-state plates, and is parked within 30 feet of the subdivision entry curve." Martha stared at her. "That curve was carved by my grandfather's plow in 1946. Cynthia's lips twitched. "Even so, it visually disrupts the neighborhood's front-facing symmetry. We've received complaints." From who, Martha wanted to say, but Will was already walking toward them from the side of the house, hands in his jacket pockets, quiet as ever. He gave a small nod to the tow truck driver, then to Cynthia. "Problem?" Cynthia raised her chin. "Not at all. Just standard procedure. You'll have to retrieve your vehicle from the impound lot at your earliest convenience." Will looked at his car, then at Cynthia, then back at Martha. "I have the deed," Martha said tightly. "The vehicle's on our land. HOA rules don't reach this far." "I'm afraid you're mistaken," Cynthia said, voice still syrupy. "The Clearbrook Hills Charter includes all visual perimeter zones extending from the road, Section 4.7b. It's about neighborhood aesthetics, harmony." Will watched her a moment longer, then said nothing, just stepped back and stood beside his sister. The tow truck whirred to life. The hook dropped. The steel chains clanked. Martha stepped forward again, but Will gently touched her arm. "Let it go," he said quietly. The SUV's front wheels lifted, The truck grunted, and with a screech of rubber and steel, the car rolled backward up the ramp. Cynthia handed a printed fine notice to Martha, along with a folded flyer advertising an upcoming HOA beautification initiative. "You'll want to make sure everything else on the property is up to code," she said sweetly. She turned and strode back toward the paved road, her heels clicking smartly. The truck pulled away, kicking up dust. Will stood still for a long time, watching the road long after the vehicle disappeared from sight. Then, almost to himself, he said, "That woman has no idea what she's just done." Martha looks over. "You're going to do something about it, aren't you?" Will, almost smiling, "In due time." The next morning, Martha finds an unmarked envelope slipped into her mailbox. Inside is a map, her property, with red lines drawn through the north pasture. She stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, the paper fluttering in her hand as a soft breeze rustled the pine needles above. The envelope had no return address, no postmark. The map itself was a photocopy of the Bellamy Land Survey, but thick red ink carved across the northern edge, slicing straight through the alfalfa rows. Back in the kitchen, she laid it out on the old oak table, its corners curling upward like leaves in summer heat. Will, seated with a mug of black coffee and yesterday's county newspaper, glanced up without a word. She slid the paper toward him. "It was in the mailbox," she said. "No name, just that." Will didn't reach for it right away. He studied the paper with narrowed eyes. The red lines weren't random. They aligned perfectly with the natural slope of the pasture, following the tree line, and clipped just past the Bellamy fence into what was supposed to be HOA-maintained buffer. Martha folded her arms. "Remember the letter they sent last week? The one with that phrase, 'expected transitions in land use'? I thought it was just more HOA gibberish." Will nodded, finally picking up the paper and turning it toward the light. "This looks like a parcel overlay," he said. "Something you'd find in a zoning proposal?" "Zoning?" she asked. "Or rezoning," he said, rising. "And if that's the case, we're not dealing with HOA pettiness anymore. This could be land grab maneuvering." Before Martha could respond, a light rap came at the screen door. Walter Jenkins stood outside, holding a foil-wrapped tray and a USB drive balanced on top. "Didn't mean to interrupt breakfast," he said, pushing his ball cap back. "But I figured you might want this." He stepped inside, setting the tray on the counter. "Banana bread. Marjorie made too much. And I pulled the camera from yesterday." Martha blinked. "Your driveway camera?" Walter grinned. "It faces east. Caught everything. The truck, that Wexler woman, and the spot where the car was parked. It wasn't on HOA property." Will nodded, accepting the drive. "Appreciated." They watched the footage on Will's laptop, the screen propped beside the toaster. The timestamp was clear. The angle showed the car sitting squarely on Bellamy land. In the background, Cynthia stood with her arms crossed, looking entirely too comfortable. Martha clenched her jaw. She knew. Will didn't answer. He was already typing, his fingers moving deliberately over the keys. Minutes later, he closed the laptop. "I want to check something," he said. That afternoon, they made the hour's drive to Clark County Courthouse. The records office sat on the second floor, its walls lined with oak filing cabinets and posters about local tax ordinances. A ceiling fan clicked overhead, too slow to be helpful. The clerk behind the counter was a middle-aged woman with cat-eye glasses and a Waffle House coffee mug. When Will introduced himself, she blinked twice, then smiled faintly. "Judge Bellamy," she said. "Didn't expect to see you back in Clark?" Will gave a polite nod. "Just helping my sister sort some property questions." Martha felt oddly small beside him, like they'd walked into a different world, where Will held some quiet authority that even she forgot he had. The clerk led them to a back terminal. Will scrolled through scanned land records, clicking with purpose. A few minutes in, he stopped. "There," he said. Martha leaned in. It was a rezoning application filed by Clearbrook Development Advisory Committee, a name she didn't recognize, but it claimed unclaimed buffer zones adjacent to northern parcels were eligible for green space beautification pending board approval. Parcel number 347F-, her land dash was listed under subject to review. "Subject to review?" she repeated. "That's our pasture." Will's jaw tensed. "It's labeled unclaimed, which is inaccurate, but it gets worse." He opened a second document, this one digitally signed. Martha didn't recognize the signature, but Will stared at it for several long seconds. "Samuel Creighton," he said quietly. "Who?" she asked. Will closed the file. "A developer tried to push a rezoning through the state highway corridor 4 years ago. I ruled against him in court. He wasn't pleased." Martha stared at him. "You think he's working with Cynthia?" "I think," Will said, pulling his leather-bound notebook from his satchel. "This isn't just about a car anymore. They're after your land. Cynthia calls for a surprise HOA meeting, open to neighboring property owners, scheduled conveniently during peak farm hours." Martha had spent most of the morning mending a fence post that a storm had knocked crooked the night before. The cows were restless, the chickens loud, and the sun already pushing hard on her shoulders. So when the flyer showed up, stuck to the mailbox with a branded Clearbrook Hills magnet, she didn't even need to read it twice to understand the timing. A 2 p.m. meeting on a Wednesday? It wasn't just inconvenient, it was calculated. She remembered what Walter had told her last week, sitting on her porch with a glass of iced tea in hand. "They pulled the same stunt on the Parker farm," he'd said. "Called it buffer expansion, but it was just a way to nibble off land the HOA couldn't legally own. One meeting, no objections, and boom, rezoned before anyone noticed." That warning echoed now as she brushed the dust from her jeans and nodded to Will, who had just emerged from the barn in a fresh collared shirt. "You sure you want to go?" she asked. Will checked his watch. "It's a public meeting," he said. "They invited neighboring property owners." The Clearbrook Hills Community Center stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, pristine and freshly painted. Small flags hung above the door, and rows of identical sedans lined the lot. Inside, the smell of lemon-scented cleaner clung to the air. A long table near the entrance held cookies, lemonade, and stacks of HOA pamphlets. The folding chairs were arranged in neat rows before a small podium and projector screen. Martha and Will entered quietly. Martha took a seat near the back. Will stood. Cynthia Wexler stood at the front of the room, flanked by 2 board members and a smiling young man fumbling with the projector remote. She wore a powder blue blazer and held a remote of her own, clicking through slides that showed bar graphs, shaded zoning maps, and stock photos of manicured lawns. "We're here today," she began, "to present Phase 2 of our Clearbrook Beautification Plan, an initiative to preserve property values and create a shared community experience through thoughtful land usage." Several heads nodded. One elderly woman clapped twice, unsure whether it was the right moment. Cynthia clicked to a slide showing a satellite image. Red boundaries flickered into view. "As you can see, we've identified areas currently underutilized or inconsistently maintained, which can be improved through annexation and green space integration." Will raised a hand. Cynthia paused, her smile flickering. "Yes, sir?" "I'm William Bellamy. I live just outside the subdivision. Would you clarify which parcels are being reevaluated under Phase 2? She gave a tight smile. "The presentation is purely preliminary. The parcels in question are mostly buffer zones, no formal ownership." Will tilted his head. "I believe parcel 347F was mentioned in your prior filings. That's registered to my sister." A murmur stirred among the audience. Cynthia's jaw shifted slightly. All filings, she said, are under review by the appropriate committees. Who authorized those filings? Will asked, voice polite. Cynthia stepped away from the podium. I'm sorry, but this is a community meeting, and as a non-resident, I was invited, Will said, holding up the flyer. It reads, open to neighboring property owners. I believe that applies. Cynthia turned to the board members, one of whom, a balding man with thick glasses, began leafing through a binder, flustered. Will continued, each question a chess piece sliding across the board. Has the HOA retained legal counsel to review the Americans with Disabilities Act in conjunction with these proposed changes? Someone in the crowd coughed. A woman in the second row leaned forward. And what about the Federal Land Use Charter? Will asked. Annexing or adjusting land classifications across jurisdictional lines typically requires at least a preliminary review at the county level. Has that happened? The board member with the binder fumbled and dropped a sheaf of papers. One fluttered to the ground, facing up. Martha, rising from her chair, stepped forward and picked it up. At the top, in bold print, it read, Rezone Initiative, Phase 2. Martha held the page aloft. This doesn't look preliminary, she said quietly. Cynthia reached for the paper, but not before half the room saw it. Cameras lifted. A couple of phones clicked. Will remained still, eyes on Cynthia. She narrowed hers. This meeting is being derailed. Will smiled slightly. Just asking questions. A neighbor leaned to Cynthia and whispers, Who is that guy? Cynthia doesn't answer. Just after sunrise, Martha spots a black sedan pulling up the gravel road. Inside, Will is reviewing typed legal documents on a clipboard. She watched from the porch, the steam from her coffee rising in the morning chill. The black sedan eased up the drive like it belonged there, dust curling in its wake. Will sat behind the wheel, his reading glasses perched low on his nose, flipping through a sheaf of papers clipped together with methodical precision. He didn't look up right away, just scribbled something with a blue pen in the margin of one document, then set it aside. By the time Martha stepped off the last porch step, he was already climbing out of the car. "Good morning," he said, handing her a manila folder. "Filed it last night before the clerk's office closed. It's in the system." She opened the folder. The top page bore the official seal of Clark County Superior Court. Motion for emergency injunction was typed in bold across the top. Martha blinked. "You really filed it?" "I did," he said. "If they move forward, they're in violation of state code. The county will have no choice but to intervene." From down the road came the low rumble of Walter's truck. The old pickup coughed as it turned into the driveway. Walter climbed out, a thumb drive pinched between his fingers. "Caught them this time," he said. "Last night, 2 of them out with flashlights and measuring tape. Marjorie said they were on your land for 20 minutes. Will took the drive without a word. "I'll add it to the packet." Walter raised an eyebrow. "What packet?" Will gave a half smile. "The one I'll be delivering tonight." The Clear Brook Community Hall was full before sunset. Rows of folding chairs were packed tight. Some neighbors stood at the back, arms crossed, whispers flying like bees at a picnic. Cynthia Wexler stood at the front in a sharp emerald blazer, her hair pinned back in perfect coils. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you all for coming," she said, clicking the handheld remote in her palm. The screen behind her lit up with a pastel-colored diagram titled Community Land Access Zones, Phase 2. Martha sat near the front, Will beside her, posture calm, hands folded. Walter was on the end of the row, a thermos in his lap. Cynthia launched into her presentation, describing strategic green corridors, harmonized boundaries, and shared visibility compliance. The language was smooth, practiced, but a few heads were already tilting in confusion. "And now," Cynthia said, "we'll open the floor for a community vote to proceed with exploratory integration." Will rose slowly. "Before that happens," he said, voice even, "I'd like to introduce myself properly." Cynthia's smile faltered. "Sir, I believe we've already—" "My name is William Bellamy," he said, raising his voice just slightly. "Former United States District Judge, 8th Circuit, retired last March, and currently a landowner directly affected by these proceedings." The room hushed. Even the clicking of Cynthia's remote stopped. Will stepped forward, holding up a packet. "Contained here is an injunction request already filed with Clark County Superior Court. It details a pattern of violations by this HOA, including but not limited to unauthorized towing, attempted fraudulent rezoning, unlawful trespassing, and misrepresentation of buffer zones." He turned slightly, his tone never rising, but his words sharpened like a blade, honed for just this moment. "There is also new footage," he continued, "submitted this morning showing HOA surveyors entering private land without consent after dark, accompanied by documents containing forged digital signatures, one of which belongs to a known developer previously involved in multiple rezoning scandals." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A man near the back stood up to get a better view. Will laid copies of deeds on the table before Cynthia. "Here are notarized documents confirming the boundaries of Bellamy Farm. These were never in dispute until this board made them so." Cynthia's lips parted, but no sound came. "You're welcome to contest these findings in court," Will said. "But until then, no vote held here tonight would be considered legally binding. Furthermore, the Georgia State Housing Oversight Office has been notified and will be reviewing the HOA's actions this month." Martha sat stone still, her hands in her lap. Walter chuckled under his breath. "Now that's a speech." Will looked across the room. "This isn't about aesthetics. It's about ownership, and no neighborhood charter gives you the right to erase history with a red marker." He stepped back. For a long moment Cynthia said nothing. Then she turned to her board. "We will recess briefly," she said, voice taut. But no one moved. Instead, chairs creaked as neighbors leaned forward. Cell phones lifted. Several began recording. And in the silence, a voice rose near the center row. "So the judge just shut it all down?" Cynthia stares at the crowd in disbelief as neighbors begin pulling out their phones and recording her. At Cotton Hollow Diner the next morning, copies of the local paper are flying off the counter. Front page headline, "Federal Judge Exposes HOA Overreach in Willow Creek." The place was buzzing louder than the percolator behind the counter. Every booth was filled, the air thick with the smell of bacon grease and disbelief. Some folks held coffee cups frozen halfway to their mouths, reading and rereading the article. Others whispered in low tones, eyes darting from the bold headline to the grainy black and white photo of Will Bellamy standing calmly at the podium, a stack of legal files in hand. Martha sat in a corner booth near the window, watching it all. She didn't say much, just stirred cream into her coffee and listened. Will, sitting across from her, flipped through a second copy of the paper. The waitress, Connie, leaned in to top off their mugs. "I always knew that Cynthia woman was trouble," she muttered, nodding toward the photo. "But I didn't think anyone could actually stand up to her. You two—" "Wow!" Martha smiled faintly. "It's not over yet." As they stepped out of the diner, the parking lot was already filling with trucks and hatchbacks from nearby farms. Some waved, a few gave cautious nods, but many approached. "Is it true she forged property lines?" "She threatened my wife last winter over a garden flag." "I got fined for a fence that was here when we bought the place." By the time they made it back to Bellamy Farm, half a dozen neighbors had followed. The barn, which had once stored feed and tools, now held folding chairs and a dry erase board. Will stood near the entrance, answering questions with calm precision, guiding residents through the HOA charter, pointing out where Cynthia had overstepped. Martha stayed near the back, watching the crowd grow. Some brought paperwork, others just memories. Mr. and Mrs. Ramirez recounted how they'd been fined $300 for leaving a ladder visible for one afternoon. Pastor Tom spoke of a young couple forced to remove a swing set that was not approved in neutral colors. The Parkers shared a photo of their flower boxes being uprooted by HOA inspectors. The dam had cracked. Now it was flooding. That evening, Martha drafted a petition on her typewriter. Something about it felt fitting. It called for the immediate suspension of Cynthia Wexler as HOA president, a full audit of board decisions, and the creation of a community oversight panel. She delivered copies door to door with Walter and Connie, while Will kept answering legal questions in the barn. The next day, just as Martha was tending to the tomato vines behind the house, Cynthia arrived in a white Lexus. She stepped out briskly, sunglasses in place, envelope in hand. "I have here a cease and desist," she announced, voice tight. "You're to stop spreading defamatory claims against me and the HOA. This ends now." Martha took the envelope without a word. Behind them, Mrs. Dorsey, 84, sharp as ever, shuffled toward the front gate with her walker. Cynthia turned, recognizing her. "Oh, and you," Cynthia snapped. "You're still in violation for those yard ornaments. Gnomes are not sanctioned by the Clearbrook Style Guide." Mrs. Dorsey blinked, then slowly raised her phone. "Smile," she said. The flash went off. By the next morning, the video had made its way onto Facebook. It was short but damning. Cynthia berating an elderly woman on private property, cease and desist letter still clutched in her fist. 3 HOA board members resigned by lunchtime. One did it by email, another left a voicemail at 3 a.m. The last simply packed up the office printer and drove away. Will made a quiet call to a former colleague at the Georgia Housing Commission. Within 48 hours, a public notice was filed. An official investigation into the Clearbrook Hills HOA had begun. Cynthia Wexler was placed under temporary administrative suspension, barred from signing any new HOA directives until the review concluded. The town exhaled. Late that evening, as Martha and Will sat on the porch watching the moon rise over the pasture, a dark sedan pulled up the drive. The courier stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Delivery for Martha Bellamy," he said. She signed. He handed her a thick manila envelope, the flap sealed tight, the return address unlisted. Inside were dozens of printed emails, subject lines like RI Land Expansion Proposal, RE Phase 2 Maps, and Need Creighton Signatures Scrubbed. A certified courier drops off a thick manila envelope at Bellamy Farm, containing internal HOA emails leaked anonymously. Weeks later, the Bellamy Farm backyard is strung with paper lanterns, the grill sizzles, and laughter carries on the breeze. It's the first annual Neighbors BBQ. The setting sun draped everything in gold, the barn, the cedar fence, the tables lined with checkered cloths, and mason jars full of lemonade. Kids chased each other between hay bales. Someone had brought a guitar, and an impromptu bluegrass trio had formed near the old oak tree. The scent of charcoal and peach-glazed ribs drifted over the lawn, mingling with the quiet hum of voices, easy and warm. Martha moved between clusters of neighbors with a pitcher in one hand and a worn cloth napkin slung over her shoulder. Her once guarded expression had softened. She smiled freely now, stopping to accept a hug from Mrs. Ramirez and a thank you from Pastor Tom, who had brought a cobbler that was already half gone. She climbed 2 steps onto the back porch and cleared her throat. The music paused. Conversations quieted. "I just want to say," she began, voice a little uneven, "thank you for showing up. Not just today, but these past few weeks, for standing up when it mattered, for remembering that neighbors aren't paperwork, They're people. A soft applause rolled through the crowd. Will stood at the edge of the gathering beside a hand-painted sign a few kids were finishing. Respect rural roots. He gave her a nod, then stepped forward. "I've got one more thing," he said, lifting a folded paper from his shirt pocket. As of this morning, the Georgia State Committee has approved the draft for the Fair Use and Farm Protection Act. It's moving to full review next month. The claps came louder this time. Someone whooped. "It won't solve everything," Will added, "but it'll make sure what happened here won't happen again, at least not quietly." Martha stepped down to stand beside him. "You're not going back, are you?" He glanced around the yard. "Not just yet." By twilight, the HOA office, once so sterile and imposing, was lit from within by warm lamps. The new committee had transformed it into a community help center. A bulletin board on the wall read, "Need a hand? Leave a note. Got a hand? Take a note." 2 teenagers were setting up folding chairs for an elder tech class starting next week. Former board members trickled in quietly throughout the evening. Some offered apologies. A few brought pies. One, a silver-haired woman named Lois, simply said, "We should have spoken up sooner." On the grassy strip where the tow truck had once parked, children played tag. Someone had chalked hopscotch across the walkway. No one yelled at them for it. A trio of high schoolers, notepads in hand, found Martha near the trellis and asked for an interview. "It's for civics class," they explained, "about how local action works." Martha chuckled. "Well, it starts when someone touches your brother's car without asking." Later, as the stars began to blink awake above the pasture, Will and Martha sat on the porch, side by side. The noise behind them had faded to a warm hum. The fields shimmered softly under lantern light. Fireflies danced like slow sparks in the dark. Will leaned back, eyes on the sky. This land has a future again. The next morning, just as Martha set the kettle on the stove, the screen door creaked and the mail dropped onto the doormat. Among the usual stack of coupons and seed catalogs was a letter, thick paper, embossed seal. It was from a small town in southern Georgia. They were asking for help with their HOA. Even the quietest fields can echo with the loudest truths when a community chooses to stand together. The Bellamy farm wasn't just saved by law. It was protected by memory, by neighbors rediscovering what it meant to belong. Justice, when rooted in kindness and courage, grows stronger than any rulebook. Some battles begin with a towed car, but they end with people breaking bread beneath paper lanterns. Like good soil, a neighborhood must be tended, with patience, with care, and with the will to say, "This is worth keeping.